الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى محمد وآله وصحبه ومن بهداه مقتدى أما بعد. Jazakumullah for coming to our event today. So the title is actually Love and Addiction. The adjective in their love, but generally it is a form of addiction. But we'll talk about addiction inshallah generally today. And we're inshallah hopefully talk about these details. But just quickly about the importance of this topic. This is one of the things that we as a community, whether as Muslims or even just larger community, considering the climate that we live in circumstances that make it easier for individuals to become addicted. And perhaps in ways that we never thought that addiction is possible. Or in ways that we don't think or initially think that this is actually addiction. Because people most of the time when they think of addiction, they think of what? What comes to your mind? Drugs, right? But the reality is, what we're going to talk about tonight, it's not just drugs. It is something that is a bit more general. And it is affecting every individual in our society at different ages. Doesn't matter where you're coming from. We need to figure out what is this talking about, what is all this pertaining. And today, inshallah, we have with us Dr. Raymond and Sister Suzy Ismail. You know, they don't need introduction, inshallah, they're known in our community. However, I still have to give a bit of a bio, just a quick rundown. So Dr. Ray, he earned his PhD in counseling psychology from Seton Hall. He's a faculty member and a therapist, and he worked at several universities in New York and New Jersey. Quite often, if you're in Rutgers, you would see him, alhamdulillah, invited to events at Rutgers. So he also worked in a private practice, giving special attention to blending Islamic therapy with Muslims. Now, at the moment, he's currently, I guess his project, right, his baby project, he is producing mental health documentaries and an online Muslim mental health talk show called the 5 Before 5 show. So his goal is to make discussion about Islam and mental health available to Muslims through technology and social media. So on. Alright, now, Sister Suzy Ismail, alhamdulillah, she's been in a community for quite a long time. She is a graduate from New Jersey, from Rutgers University. So her degree is in Communication, English, and Middle Eastern Studies. That I think is her bachelor. And alhamdulillah, your master is also in Communication Information Studies. And mashallah, she's pursuing her PhD in the same field. In human services, with a focus on family studies and intervention strategies. Very known public speaker, alhamdulillah, very well sought after. Beautifully merges Islamic aspects of spirituality with her talks. And she's also the founder and head of communication consultant at Cornerstone. An amazing service that the Muslim community actually needs. Hopefully, inshallah, whenever I'm promoting her unintentionally, yes. But mashallah, it's well deserved, alhamdulillah. So that being said, the way we're going to conduct this, inshallah, is more so that we can kind of recap as much as we can. I'm going to do it more as a question. So I'm going to be asking the questions, trying to direct the conversation. Hope to get the most out of it. And hopefully we're going to have a question session at the end. But we also have a phone number if you want to text a question. It's an anonymous, obviously. So if you want to write this down, the phone number if you're interested in a question. 732-997-0756. Once again, it's 732-997-0756. And you can send your text, inshallah, we hopefully will answer it. But if you want to ask questions, feel free to raise your hand. Inshallah, we'll try to address it. We will have to stop for Isha. That means the session is about 25 minutes. Inshallah, we're going to convene after Isha, so it will be considered a natural break. So hopefully, inshallah, you can find your way back to the NPR group. Alright, so, first of all, the first question, actually, I'm going to try to direct. So I'm just going to hold this in my hand. So, generally speaking, we talk about addiction, so I'm going to open up a little bit. I can't say I'm not an expert, but not. Like, inshallah, we have real experts. But generally talking, if you ever try to read about addiction, they divide them usually to two categories. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. You have substance addiction and behavioral addiction. Is that right? So I'm going to ask Sister Suzy, can you kind of shed a bit more light on what is the difference between them? And can you give us an example of what is the difference between substance and then some of the examples that we have, and hopefully more of the recent things that come in behavioral. And I'm going to follow that with another question, and are they equally dangerous?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So I think this is an incredibly important topic, and I'm happy to see that we have a lot of young people with us today, because as much as we want to direct our conversation to the parents in the room, it's important that our young people also are aware and understand and know what's out there and understand what this topic of addiction really means. I think it was very critical that the topic linked not just the subject of addiction, but it was love and addiction. Because that behavioral addiction that Dr. Ahmed just began the conversation with is something that we don't often think of. And we don't usually equate the concept of love, something that we think is beautiful, something that is emotional, something that is very deep set and supposed to bring joy into the world, with the concept of addiction. But the reality is, anything that we love, and love to the point where it consumes us, love to the point that we become obsessive about it, can become an addiction. And we see this in almost anything in life. So although we often link addiction to an opioid addiction, a heroin addiction, marijuana addiction, which we're going to get into a little bit later about whether or not it is addictive, we often link it to that. The reality is, we can have a cell phone addiction, we can have an addiction to food, we can have an addiction to an individual. And I think we see this concept of becoming addicted to something because we give it too much importance, or that aspect of love becomes toxic. We see it even in examples in the Quran. And I think we see an example of a love of power, for instance, and we see many examples of that. Fir'aun, for instance, and his love of power, it became essentially an addiction. We often don't use that terminology, but in essence, it is that same concept that is evoked within someone where they need more and more and more. And we're often reminded when we read أَلْهَاكُمَ التَّكَاثُرُ حَتَّى زُرْتُمُ الْمَقَابِرَ that the nature of humanity is that sometimes we will constantly want more and more and more. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us with a tendency to lean towards that which is addictive. It is within our nature. Yet it is also part of our nature to be able to strengthen the nafs that will push away that basis self, that will push away that addictive quality when we understand and see the harm in it. And we see the example, we mentioned Fir'aun, but we see the example with Musa alayhi salam. When in Surah Taha, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to Musa alayhi salam, the first thing he speaks to him about after making his power and his glory known, he speaks to Musa alayhi salam and says, "What is this in your hand?" And Musa alayhi salam looks to the cane, the stick that he would lean upon, and he says, it is my walking stick that I lean upon. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands him to throw down that stick. And it is an understanding that within our lives, we may have sticks that we lean upon that can become dangerous. Just as we see in Surah Taha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminding us that the stick turns into a snake. And this is very similar to the poison that we may sometimes consume unwittingly because we put our reliance on something in this dunya, someone in this dunya, a substance in this dunya, or a behavior in this dunya that can turn into something as dangerous as a snake, a negative addiction. I don't think I completely answered the question because I forgot what it was, but if you want to bring me back.
So they say there's substance abuse and then there's behavior, substance addiction, behavior addictions. What is the difference? Examples?
Okay.
And are they equally dangerous?
Okay. So an addiction is an addiction. There is physical danger, and there is emotional danger, and there is mental danger. So when we say, are they equally dangerous, I think we really have to ask ourselves, what is the greatest danger that can affect us? And we know that if we define our purpose here in this dunya as the purpose of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the greatest danger is the danger to our iman. Now, many of these other addictions that are dangerous to our health, such as substance abuse or substance addictions, many of these other addictions, such as behavioral addictions, when we are addicted to a cell phone, when we are addicted to loving a person, and there's actually a terminology for it, it's called limerence, when you become so obsessed with another person that the love consumes you and becomes an addiction, and it really is, and you can probably speak a little bit more. So limerence, limerence, yes. So it is a psychological disorder, essentially, that can occur. So the danger that exists from taking the substance, the danger that exists from becoming too consumed with a person or an item, whether it is behavioral or based on a substance, it is still a danger to the self. A danger to the self in terms of how it affects our iman, a danger to the self physically, a danger mentally, and a danger emotionally. And the examples, I know as the talk unfolds today, we're going to dive into more and more examples, but there are many of us that even, if we closed our eyes for a moment and ask ourselves, what is it that pulls me and draws me away from that which is good for me? And whatever the answer to that question may be, a person, a thing, a substance, a food, a drink, whatever it may be, that's where we need to be extra careful and extra cautious because it may fall into the realm of addiction.
So since now, I'd like to talk to you that an addiction is an addiction, which kind of hints out that they almost have the same, all of the underlying basis, or the mechanism, I guess. So I'm going to direct this question to Dr. Raymond. So if all addictions are essentially the same, so we're hinting out that it has the same underlying, perhaps, biological or physiological aspect of it. Can you talk a bit more on that and how maybe perhaps it works at a mental and behavioral level at the same time?
Sorry, say that one more time.
Distracted?
Yeah.
So the question is, if they're all the same thing, so it indicates that there's a biological similarity. So what is that mechanism, and how does it affect at the level of mental and behavioral level?
Okay. All right. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. So I want to first, before I address your question, I think that a comment that I had about what Sister Suzy was saying kind of dovetails very well with that question. And so what you said was an addiction is an addiction, right? And that immediately made me think of one word, intoxicating, right? The word intoxicating. You might hear that used maybe on TV, in the newspaper, just anywhere around where a person is having an experience that is so emotionally overwhelming, usually in a positive way, but sometimes in a negative way. And they say it was intoxicating, right? You imagine a person, you have a crowd cheering and calling your name and giving you praise and applause, and that, someone would say, that feeling was intoxicating, right? Meaning it intoxicated me. Another person you might say is there, these are the terms that we use, drunk off of power. Right? This person is drunk off of their power. And in all of those instances, what we mean is that it goes to your head. Right? And really biologically, what we mean is that it goes to your brain. There's a part of your brain, and this is, I think, alhamdulillah, this is why it made me think of it when Sister Suzy said, an addiction is an addiction. There's a part of your brain, it's meant for two things. Learning and enjoyment, three things. Learning, enjoyment, and memory. But learning and memory, they're the same, right, to some degree. Right? And so this part of your brain is meant to learn and enjoy. Right? And when that part of your brain gets stimulated, not only do you enjoy, but at the same time, because it's involved in learning, it makes you remember what you enjoy. Right? Does this make sense? And so in this instance, when you do a drug, right, that drug hits that part of your brain and you get all kinds of enjoyment. And your brain immediately what? Writes it down. Oh, what was that? What drug was that? Where did I get it from? Who was it with? How much did it cost? Your brain starts to immediately learn from that enjoyment, because when you enjoy a thing, you want to do it more, and your brain holds on to how to do it more. And when something is harmful or painful to you, your brain even writes that down and says, this is what I want to continue to avoid. And so this part of your brain, it releases all kinds of chemicals within your brain that are very, that give you this sense of joy, of excitement and pleasure and all of those things. And I want you to think about this part of your brain from this perspective. How many of you saw someone eating something, right? And they let you take a bite and it was delicious, right? And it was delicious. I want to ask you this question. What was your next few responses to that person?
You don't respond? Come on, guys, I know you.
You tell them it's good, and then after that, what do you say?
What was it?
Where'd you get it from?
Where'd you get it from? What else?
The recipe, give me the
What's the recipe? And I told you, when your brain finds enjoyment, what does it immediately start to do? Learn. And that's an example, yes? You tasted that, whatever that sandwich, whatever it was, you're like, where'd you get it from? What's the recipe? How much was it? You know, is it, how far away is it from here? You start asking all kinds of questions. And then even if you forgot, you remember who you got it from, and when you want it again, you call them, right? And so this is how drugs operate in our brains, right? But drugs are not the only things, as you can see from this example, drugs are not the only things that activate that part of our brain. And that part of our brain is the center of where addiction starts, that enjoyment, right? Once you taste that enjoyment, your body, your brain is going to want more of it, whether it's good for you or whether it's bad for you. Does that make sense? Have I answered your question? Did you ask me about the biology?
Biology, yes.
I hope so.
And then what the
Okay, yes.
behavioral aspect, and then the mental.
Okay. So this is, I think that in my example that I gave you, that part of that is the biology of it. And you can see the behavior and the mental right away. Right? The behavior and the mental react to the biology. The behavior is, right, asking questions, learning more about it. You're immediately trying to get more access to this thing that you enjoy. Right? And, and not only are you trying to get more access to it, but then even mentally, you might even start thinking about how other people might enjoy it too. Right, sister, you said that you would ask for the recipe, which means that to some degree, I imagine, you want to cook it for your family, your friends, other people so that they can enjoy it too. Right? And then you start planning ways around how you're going to get more of it. Right? And so this is how the mental part of it begins. However, the other psychological part of addiction is because our brains are designed to make shortcuts, right? Our brains are designed to make shortcuts. Why? To save you time, right? Now, for instance, how many times have you been in a conversation with someone and you feel like you know what they're going to say, right? And then you immediately start to finish the person's sentence while they're talking. This has happened to you, I bet, 1,000 times if you've been in an argument, right? You don't even wait until the person is done, you just start talking, right? So in this instance, that part of your brain that's meant to take shortcuts is the part of your brain that is also responsible for you trying to find any way that you can to get to the things that you want for yourself. And usually, sometimes you're finishing a person's sentence because you want them to get to the end of what it is that they're saying. Right? Does this make sense? Now, what makes us vulnerable in terms of addiction from this perspective is the idea that once you start to Once you start to have a craving or a desire for a drug, your brain starts to take all kinds of shortcuts toward getting that drug. And what I mean by that is you start rushing through all kinds of other things. Now, I gave you the example that you're rushing through conversations, right? But then in that instance, your brain is rushing through everything else mentally and emotionally, right? I'm rushing through my interactions with my family. I'm rushing through my interactions with my friends. And I'm rushing toward an interaction with the people who have the drug. Or at least if I have the drug myself, I'm really trying to get out of this interaction with you so that I can get closer and closer toward what? My drug. Now, another way that our brain takes shortcuts. How many of you drove here? Right, you drove. How many times have you driven home from the masjid? Hundreds, if not thousands of times, yes? Sometimes you get home, you don't even remember big parts of driving home. Am I correct? That's because your brain takes shortcuts. Your brain says, I've done this a million times. I don't necessarily need to pay attention. Is that correct? And so in this instance, I'm trying to remember, I have so many examples in my head, I keep losing it. Right? Thank you. So, on your way home driving, you see a yellow light. What do? Well, yeah, thank you. What are you supposed to do? You're not necessarily supposed to stop, you're supposed to slow down. At least at the yellow light, you're supposed to slow down, and then the red light, you're supposed to stop. How many times have you pulled up to a yellow light and started to slow down, pull up to a red light, and you stop? Right? Do you have to actually think about it? No, for the most part, you see the light, you stop. The light turns green, you go, right? That's because your brain and your mind becomes habituated, right, to these signals. Does that make sense? Your brain becomes habituated to the signals. When I see a red light, I stop. When I see a green light, I go. When I see a yellow light, I look both ways and I try to fly through it, right? But in these instances, this is part also of the pathway of addiction, right? And we're going to use just, I'll use love. I was going to say drugs, but I'll use love, and then I'll try to finish here. When you see a red light, your brain automatically tells your body, you don't think about it, your brain tells your body, hit the brake. You begin to hit the brake, right? When you see the person, you might be in a toxic relationship that you're addicted to, right? And when you see that person, unconsciously, your brain starts to tell your body, draw nearer. Your brain starts to tell your body, talk to this person. Your brain starts to tell your body, respond to this text message. It pulls you into this toxic dynamic because you are addicted to it. Because your brain is used to its normal, usual pattern, right? It is habituated. Just like if you went to another country and they drive on opposite sides of the road, it's going to take your brain some time to get used to it. Imagine if tomorrow they changed the colors of the lights, right? Excuse me, there's going to be a lot of accidents because it's going to take us a long time to get used to it. This is how our minds work, right? And I hope that I'm answering the question with all of these examples, because when you talk about it mentally, it's really all of these little functions that are going on. For instance, and then I'll stop here, right? There's a lot of mental functions that go on without us realizing it. And I'm going to give you this one experiment, right? How many of you feel your butts in the seat? How many of you? How many of you? You feel your butt, your backside. How many of you feel it against the seat? Now you feel it. Did you just sit down? You've been sitting down for a long time. Why didn't you feel it? It's usual. That's correct. You're on your way. It's usual. But because it's usual, what? Somebody said you don't think. Somebody, who was that? Alhamdulillah. You don't think about it. Here's why you don't think about it. It's not that you don't think about it. It's that your brain ignores it. Right? It's that your brain ignores it. Remember I said to you, your brain is trying to save you time. Your brain is always trying to save you time and energy. Right? And so there's all kinds of things going on in your brain without you realizing it. Right? And so in this instance, this is one of the troubles of addiction. Is because you don't necessarily have to be thinking about the drug or wanting or desiring the drug to pursue it. You can see one of your old buddies that you used to smoke with. And then what? The craving hits you. Right? Just like I used the example of the sister, you know, so a friend who has this delicious food. When you see them, you're like, oh yeah. And then you start to focus on getting that information back from this person. This is how our brains work, and since there's so many processes at play, it can be very, very difficult to break these cycles of addiction. I mean, we talked about biology, we talked about behavior, we talked about mental. Again, I know we're going to stress this point, but that's why it's so important to get help through these addictions, because it's very hard to do it by yourself.
So this actually kind of goes into my next question. But I don't think we have enough time to answer it, but I'm going to ask it right now, hopefully we can do it later on. The question is how would a person figure out that they themselves are addicted to something? Or how can they spot an addiction in someone? Whether they're family members, whether they're friends, whatever the case is. Inshallah, both of you inshallah, but we'll start inshallah when we come back with Sister Suzy. We literally have about, just 2 minutes for the Isha. So inshallah, hopefully if you get ready for yourself, Aisha, we don't want to rush together, and we'll just take our time. We will come back inshallah afterwards, because we have quite a few topics inshallah, whether some of the modern aspects of things, but also more importantly, how do we deal with these things? And then how does it affect us socially and all these aspects? Exactly. We'll convene inshallah after the salah. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Jazakumullah khair for coming back to continuing our session. So where we left off was the question I had following is how do you know that you yourself might be addicted to something, or you yourself might have an addiction, or spot an addiction in a family member or someone who's close to you or a family friend? I'm going to start with Sister Suzy, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum everyone again. So we're going to try to keep our answers a little bit briefer than before so that we can get to the questions from the audience as well. But how do you know when you are addicted to something or when someone else is addicted? And the reality is that we want the intervention to occur way before the addiction has already settled in, because it's much harder to disentangle something that has become a habit that is detrimental to you once it has become a full-on addiction. So, certain signs. So, we often talk about pornography addiction, for instance, and it's something that we hear quite frequently. There are several books written on it, and it's a phenomenon that we're seeing at younger and younger ages. And unfortunately, it's actually the highest area in the world, or the highest rate of pornography addictions are in Middle Eastern and Southeast Asian countries. So this is a concern. And we'll often see that when we kind of navigate backwards and try to understand how did this behavior that is clearly detrimental, that is clearly not in line with our elements of hayat in our deen, that is clearly not in line with what it means to be a Muslim, how does it become so rampant in Muslim communities? And we see that when we trace it backwards, it often begins with a look. It begins with a glance. It begins with letting your guard down and thinking just a little. It's not a big deal, it's just a little. And this is how we often lull our brain into believing that it's not going to happen to us. And it's the same pattern that we will see with the person who says, I just tried a joint. I just tried, a pill. I took a little because I thought it would help. And that little becomes a lot and a lot and a lot. If you wake up in the morning and the first thing you think about is let me check my Facebook feed, let me see how many people like my Instagram picture, let me take a look at my phone, you may be addicted. It may be that that is what consumes you. It may be that that is what takes priority in your life. If you know that you have to go somewhere, if you know that you have a job, you have work, you have something that you have to do, and you find yourself sitting on your computer and you're like, let me just look at one more website. Let me just binge watch one more Netflix show. Let me just, do one more thing. You could be addicted. And when we see these behaviors within our communities as well, within our family members, within our youth, this is a red flag. When something takes a priority and disrupts the flow of our lives, when something takes a priority and keeps us from moving forward in our lives in a way that fulfills our purpose, in a way that allows us to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a way that allows us to connect with our family, in a way that allows us to connect with our friends, to go to work, to have a healthy life, then it could be an addiction. So you will know that you yourself, or someone you know, or someone you love or care about is addicted when they become consumed with something, an item, a thought, an action. And a lot of times we'll link that to like OCD, and we'll say, oh, he's a little OCD. And we'll joke about OCD as being something like, oh, he's a little OCD. But obsessive compulsive disorder, which is the act of doing something over and over and over again, often can be linked to a certain extent to the same response that the body has to an addiction. And it's interesting because we often think of addictions as being, you can only be addicted to something bad for you. But that's not the case. We have clients, for example, that come to Cornerstone that suffer from scrupulosity. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term scrupulosity, but essentially it's a type of OCD that is linked to religious fervor. So we have clients, for example, who make wudu so often and spend so much time making wudu over and over again that their hands are bloody from how many times they've washed their hands. We have clients who will spend 3 to 4 hours praying one rak'ah because they will repeat the ayah over and over and over again. This is a type of OCD, this is a type of obsessive compulsive disorder, but it can be linked to an addiction where it began with something healthy. I want to pray, I want to make wudu. But when the thought of doing it correctly becomes all-consuming, becomes obsessive, it is very much linked to what happens to us when we become addicted to something.
So essentially, I guess the sign is that it really interferes with your life. Alright, so I'm gonna ask another question because sometimes, I guess it becomes very difficult sometimes depending on what kind of addiction a person has. And I guess I can ask you this because a lot of times, for example, when people might be using, not necessarily an addictive drug, but just a over-the-counter perhaps drug, or any sort of anything that they have, and it's the use that they're using, they never think that they're addicted. So are they being honest with themselves in most situations, or is it just is it abuse, or is it really addiction? Is there a difference between it or not? I'll give you an example because sometimes I kind of wonder this. So when I teach my classes in college, sometimes it gets very irritating because literally every 3 minutes I can tell the same person, put your phone away. Just an example. And they don't seem to think that there's something wrong. And I keep joking that this is their sixth finger, that they can't get rid of it. But can you I guess could there be a denial, right? Because maybe we're thinking, once again, we're thinking that might not possibly interfere with our lives. So is there any form of addiction that might not can go unsensed or unseen or unknown because maybe perhaps we're dealing with it in our daily life normally, and we're like, okay, I'm surviving. It's not really impeding with anything else.
So I guess the answer is like yes and no, right? To the idea, I like to believe for the most part that the answer is almost 99% of the time going to be yes, right? Allah says, right? That certainly mankind is going to be a witness over his own self, though he might put forward excuses, right? And I always use that ayah to explain to people, there's always a part of us that knows, right? And even in therapy for myself, I don't allow people to say I don't know, right? Because what I found is that people say I don't know when they really say I don't feel like thinking about it, right? Or I'd rather not confront what the answer is. And what I found is that when you don't let people say, I don't know, when you explain to them, it's for your benefit that you actually come up. And in other ways, I'll say to them, if you had 3 guesses, what would it be? And they always, of course, their 3 guesses are exactly what the issue is, right? And it's because there's a part of us that really does know. It can become very, very difficult for us to confront it because even though addiction is bad for us, we get something out of it that we enjoy, right? Even though addiction is bad for us, we get something out of it that we enjoy. And so remember I said to you that your brain is invested in getting more of the thing you enjoy. And so one way that you do that is to be in denial, or at least not be fully aware of the addiction, right? And so one of the ways in which we do that is we underestimate our use, right? Because there's a difference between use and abuse and addiction, right? Use is when you just use it, right? You would say like people who drink socially, right? Or who smoke weed socially, right? They every once in a while, maybe just once a weekend in 1 month or something like that. In terms of drugs, we will call that use. Abuse is when you use something outside of its intended purpose and outside of what is the normal cultural, societal expectation for it, right? So for instance, and again, may Allah protect us from this, we're using drugs as examples, but in American culture, it's normal to drink, right? And so a person who drinks on the weekends with his friends is using, right? A person who drinks before a job interview is abusing, right?
Not addicted.
Huh?
Not addicted.
And here's the definition of addiction, right? A part of addiction is you're using it despite the negative effects it has on you and the people around you. Number 2, there's a certain tolerance that you built up where you have to keep using more and more and more to get the same effect. Number 3, is if you were to stop using it, your body would have a negative reaction to the absence of the drug, right? And we're talking about drugs, but this is the same thing even for relationships. When you have an addictive, toxic relationship, your body has a negative reaction to the absence of the person, right? And so all of us, to some degree, we know that it's there. Part of it really, the degree to which we're able to acknowledge it is really sometimes the degree to which we want that thing in our lives despite how much it actually hurts us and is problematic and is detrimental. Make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay. Have I answered it?
No, you didn't. You answered.
Okay.
Now that's actually kind of, because you last one you went off is when you talk about emotional attachment. I have to bring this up because, you know, obviously February 14th is kind of rolling around the corner.
What's February 14th?
You know, it's just February 14th, the middle of the month. So, alhamdulillah. So somebody's anniversary. But generally speaking, so the question always comes, because I've seen this sometimes, and they call it, you know, addicted to love, right? So is love an addiction? Is it a real thing? And when does someone or something that you love, so it doesn't have to be someone, but something that you actually love, can turn into something that is more toxic or dangerous? And I guess another question is, maybe, I don't know if you can incorporate that into it, but what is codependence? Is that included in that or not?
Really good questions. And I think in order to answer that question, we also have to look at this idea of attachment and being pulled towards something from the Islamic perspective as well. So Islamically speaking, in our deen, we have the concept of zuhd. And many of you may know, you might have a friend named Zahid, you may have heard the word Zahid, but what does that mean? What does that zuhd mean? Essentially, it means a detachment, an ability to say, I love this, and this may be something halal, it may be something within the confines of the permissible. But even that which is halal, when we put too much attachment towards it, when we become too focused on it that it pulls us away from our iman, from our salah, it can fall into the realm of impermissible. And so the concept of zuhd or detachment means being able to step away. Emotional addictions are addictions that are rooted in the inability to detach. And they can come in so many different shapes and forms. And we often don't think of some of these interactions as addictions or some attachments as addictions. And I'll give you an example. Many of us, and this topic often comes up when we have marriage talks, many of us may have either experienced ourselves or may have friends or family members who have experienced great difficulty in their marriage from the in-laws. And many times it will be that, questions such as, my husband has never been able to detach from his mom, or my mother-in-law has never been able to detach from her son. Now the love of the mother to her son, and the son to his mother, of course there is no other like it. And we know that in the Quran, from the hadith, we know the importance of the parents, we know the importance of the mother. Yet there can come a point where the attachment to a person, such as the love of a mother to her son, can turn into something that is unhealthy, can turn into something that is bordering on the realm of an emotional addiction. When a parent puts all of their attention, their focus, their love to a point of possessiveness on their child, that becomes an unhealthy attachment, and that attachment can turn into an emotional addiction. The same goes for a person. We mentioned that word limerence earlier on, which is the idea of being so obsessed with the idea of love itself that you anchor this emotional attachment to someone regardless of whether or not they are healthy for you, regardless of whether or not it is a relationship that is beneficial from both an Islamic perspective and an emotional perspective. And you anchor that love to the person to the point where you eat, you breathe, you sleep, you think it is all about that person. And that is not healthy either. So emotional attachments can lead into addiction. The term codependence was brought up. Codependence is often when we begin to rely on that emotional high from someone or something else, that we become dependent upon that which is giving us the emotional high. And again, it can be incredibly dangerous. We see it often in what we describe as toxic relationships in marriages or even prior to marriage. When someone focuses so wholly on getting their validation, on getting their emotional stimulus from another person, they are bound to be disappointed. And we see the example of that sense of detachment. We see it in the example of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. He made sincere dua to be blessed with a child. And when he was blessed with Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, the first test that he was given by Allah was to detach, to leave this infant that he had made sincere dua for, and the mother of the child, Hajar, in the desert. And it's a test of that zuhd that we're talking about. Can you step away from that which could be an unhealthy attachment? And the child, Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us this example to see that even something as beautiful and as blessed as a child can become an unhealthy attachment if we are not aware and recognizing how the emotional link can cause us to neglect or forget what else is a priority in our life.
Alright, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit. How many people of you guys have games in your houses, like video games? Can I see your hands up? Video games, consoles, Xboxes, PlayStations, Nintendo. Come on, I don't see your hands. Hands up, be proud. Fortnite, who plays Fortnite? No, boys play Fortnite. Okay, can I safely say everybody in this place? Alright, how about phones? Computers, social media. Alright, the reason I'm mentioning this is because, I can't remember which year, it was recently. Gaming was included in addiction. What, Dr. Raymond, do you know how long ago was gaming introduced into addiction, into the manual?
Oh, probably like in the last 8 years or something.
Gaming was introduced, and then there's something else recent.
Like the DSM.
I can't remember. But anyway, but this kind of piques my interest because my question is, considering we're obviously in the 21st century and everybody, in their houses we have phones, we have internet, social media, games. So the question is, how is it that we're becoming addicted without even noticing it? Because definitely we have some sort of addiction. So how is it that we get addicted without even noticing? And is it an issue only with the youth? Right? So can adults also have that issue?
So I have two admissions, I guess, to make. So the second part of the question, is it just the youth or is it adults? I think that I want to use this as an opportunity to say, I think adults focus too much on addressing the problems of the youth, right? And what I mean by that is that they shouldn't focus, unless this is happening. But every time I get invited to a masjid, they say, oh, our youth. And I'm like, what about the adults? Do the adults need any kind of programming or support? Are the adults having no issues whatsoever that need to be addressed? And so I'm glad that it's put this way, because I think that when we talk about any concerns that are going on in the community, since the adults are in charge, the adults only think about the children, right? And so I think that in answering this question, it's not just about addiction, but take a real look at yourself in general so that you can fix whatever you need to be fixed or work on whatever needs to be worked on, alhamdulillah. Now, my second admission is I just got a new phone. And it tells me my weekly average of screen time. And I was appalled. Because I don't feel like, I'm like, when did I do that, right? I'm glad to see it's going down, alhamdulillah, but gaming addiction is really screen addiction. It really comes down to be screen addiction. It's a very, very real phenomenon. I've actually had a lot of clients come in they're really struggling to be even present in their lives. You know, they can't hold down jobs. They're not succeeding in their educations. They're stuck at home living with their parents because they can't get out of the house to do anything. Sometimes there's an underlying issue, and I think that this is something important to understand about addiction. Oftentimes you'll find that addiction is actually the second issue to another issue that was there first, right? And so a lot of times you'll find that people are addicted to something because there's some sort of emotional pain that they're struggling with, and that addiction helps distract them from it or numb them from it, or is the only source of pleasure they can get from whatever their struggles are. I know that in our lead up to preparing, Sister Suzy brought up cutting as an addiction. People who self-harm, you know, people who, and you'll find that men and women, sometimes they'll cut themselves on their arms, their legs, you know, other parts of their bodies that are hidden. And oftentimes what you'll find is that they say, I needed to cut myself to feel something. I was so numb, or I was feeling so bad that I needed to feel something else. Or a lot of different things, or sometimes they're like, I needed to focus on something else besides the feeling that I had. You know, they'll cut themselves and they'll watch themselves bleed because they're distracting themselves from it. And then they become, it works, which is the number one problem with drugs, is that they work. And so because it works, you keep turning to it and turning to it and turning to it. The problem with your phones is that you're not doing it on purpose. The phone is doing it to you. Right? The problem with Facebook is you're not doing it on purpose. Facebook is doing it to you. Meaning, all of these devices and our games and all of the things that we really enjoy. I mean, raise your hand if you've ever gotten lost in YouTube. How did it happen, right? You went to do one thing, and you looked at the suggestions on the side, and you're like, oh, okay, all right, that's cool, boom. And then, before you know, I myself on my computer, I will have like 9, 10 tabs of YouTube videos open at one time that I'll never watch. How many Word documents do I have with the web addresses copied into them? Like, one day I'm gonna get back to these. It's ridiculous. And part of it is to understand that the psychology and the science behind how our devices are designed today, the psychology and the science behind how our apps are designed today, even advertisements. How many times I just happened to be, I was driving in Patterson, I hadn't eaten all day, I looked at like this bucket of fried chicken, on the shop window, and I was going to get food. I got the food, and I literally left my car and walked all the way like 4 or 5 blocks to this chicken place, and like, I gotta try it. And these things are designed this way because it's meant to entice us. And what parts of our brain is it meant to stimulate? That part where the learning and the pleasure is. Right? And it's so unconscious that it works on you that you have to make a conscious choice. Again, back to this idea, do we know when you're addicted to or not? I bet you're addicted and you don't know. Even for myself, I had to admit when I saw that. I was on the phone for how long? And how much of that was really pornography? Right? 4 minutes when I was in line before they called me and shut the app. And that's it. And so part of it is really to start to understand where your weaknesses are and to begin to acknowledge them. These things are designed to draw you in. Right? And so what you have to do is assume that that's happening and protect yourself. Don't lie to yourself about how much you can control and what you can, because if it was alcohol and you were saying the same thing, we would say, brother, you don't understand what you're doing. It's the same thing with your phone, it's the same thing with social media, it's the same thing with the video game. And you have to find concrete ways to cut your access, right? Meaning, sleep with your phone in a different room, right? If your children have video games, the video game as parents, keep the video game in your room. Bring it out so they can play, and then take it and put it back where it belongs, so that when the game is not in their sight, it's not calling to them, right? And they're better able to resist it. Same thing with your phone, and I find myself saying this to people who sometimes have addiction to pornography, when they look at pornography on their phones. I tell them, leave your phone in the car outside. Right? Leave your phone in the car outside. Leave your computer and the phone, both of them outside. And they say, isn't that ridiculous? I have to go so far. And I said, that's how far you have to go to break it. Because if it's in the house, it's going to call you. Right? Even, sometimes you'll find that when you put the computer in the living room, it's still calling people. You think, they're not going to act up. We're here. We're supervising. They're going to find a way, because that part of their brain that wants it is going to look for any and every. You have kids, and you know, I know this myself. If I'm talking to my wife, we both know within 15 seconds, if he's being quiet, one of us has to go check on him. Why? Because his brain is working all day. Whenever they're not looking, I'm going to put something in the toilet. I'm going to play in the sink. I'm going to get gum out of my mom's purse. I'm going to do something when they're not looking. It's not on his mind all day, but his brain is unconsciously working on that thing. Now it's my time to get my desire. And so I'm giving you all of this because I think it's so important, not just about the gaming issue, but with everything. You have to set concrete rules about how and when and where and how long you're going to do these things.
So there's one thing you touched on. It's sometimes how we unintentionally get addicted because we're looking for comfort.
Yeah.
And you mentioned cutting. But there's also something that was very readily available in our home that most people don't realize, which is food. Is that right? How many people are addicted to food and they don't know it? I personally didn't realize that I was addicted to chocolates, I guess, until I decided for some odd reason to stop anything that is artificial sugar. And then I started getting this craving,
Withdrawal,
right?
that's the withdrawal.
It's withdrawal, right? The craving. Doesn't happen with coffee though. Alhamdulillah.
You see he's making excuses, right?
So, but I didn't realize that. So I'm going to ask turn to you. So food, do you see that often as an addiction? And like, how do you figure out you're addicted to food or not? Because remember, we use like emotional, whether you're sad, not just sad, maybe even happy, right? When you celebrate, what do you do when you celebrate? Basbousa, right? And kanafa, and all these beautiful, nice things of it now. And it starts to get me thinking sometimes, do we have problems? Do we have, I don't know, maybe it's just, I guess they give you that answer because.
That's a very good point, and it's another example of something that is completely halal, even something that's good for us, but in moderation. And this is, again, it's that reminder that our deen is a deen of moderation, and our lives should be one of moderation. Emotional eating is something that I think all of us have probably experienced it at some point in our lives, where you're sad or you're happy and you grab the ice cream and or the chocolate chip cookies or whatever it is that kind of puts you in that place. And again, when we take it to a point where it is no longer healthy for us, it is no longer fulfilling what the need is, then we can't contain it, and it turns into an addictive behavior often. And I think I just wanted to touch upon a point that was brought up here, and the topic of Fortnite. I think this is a really important topic, and I don't know how many of our young people here tend to play Fortnite, but the reason why this game in particular really does fall very heavily under the gaming addictions realm is because it's very different from Call of Duty or Halo or even Grand Theft Auto, where a few years back we would bemoan the fact that these games existed and there's violence and whatnot. But with Fortnite, the creators of Fortnite actually came out with a release of how they created the game. And essentially what they did was they spent years studying the mindset of a gambler. And they're trying to understand what was the high that gamblers get from feeling like, let me just add one more coin. Let me just pull the slot machine one more time. They've lost their homes, they've lost their families, they've lost their children, and they're still playing. And so the creators of Fortnite studied how does a gambler's mind continue to want, despite knowing that so much is being lost. And after studying the brainwaves, essentially, of gamblers, they created this game, and it is modeled after the exact stimulus that winds up encouraging gamblers to continue. And it is modeled in the way that no one ever fully wins at Fortnite. So there's always where you get really, really close. So it's not like other video games where it's like you lose, and then you're like, okay, I lost. You don't actually completely lose either. There's always this possibility that if you add one more weapon to your arsenal, if you add one more item to your box, if you assemble one more person on your team, then you're going to win. And it's dangled in front of the child just enough to give them that sense that they might win. So when we see people who are addicted to buying lottery tickets, when we see people who are addicted to going to Atlantic City and the casinos or Las Vegas, a lot of times it is that same sense of just one more. When we see people who are addicted to drugs, who are addicted to heroin, who are addicted to opioids, who are addicted to crack cocaine, a lot of times they'll say, just one more hit. I'm just going to do it one more time, and I'm not going to do it anymore after that. But they do it that one more time, and it's that same sense of just one more time, then this will be the last time. And we are seeing it in our children now, kids as young as 9, 10, 11 years old, addicted to games like Fortnite, where they can no longer study, they can't go to school, they're sneaking out of their beds at night and playing the game when their parents are asleep. Their parents are telling them, no more, that's enough, they're like, one more time, just one more game. It is a real problem, and it's linked to everything we've been talking about. That stimulus that encourages the brain to do something one more time. And we see it in alcohol, we see it in pornography, we see it in emotional addictions, we see it in physical addictions. And I think being aware of that sense of self, again, we go back to that ayah in the Quran, always wanting more and more. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows us. He knows that that's how we've been created. So how do we stop ourselves from falling into that? We don't enter into that more in the first place. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us, اعلموا إنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة. This life is but play and entertainment and adornment. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows it's part of life, but we need to know where to draw the line. And I saw you reaching out for something. So.
I just, subhanAllah is brilliant, right? Because while you were talking, I was thinking, and most of us think they just wanted to make a cool game. You would think they just want to come up with a super awesome game. And while we think that that's what they're doing this.
We're going to talk about food.
Oh, food. I got all excited about Fortnite. So food. Again, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given in His rahmah, He's given us that bounty. He's given us the understanding that food, it not only nourishes us, but it tastes good, right? And we're even promised in Jannah, inshaAllah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all of those who enter Jannah. We will have our rewards even in rivers of milk and honey. So the senses are definitely stimulated by the taste of food, by the comfort of food. But again, just as the senses are stimulated by having a nice time with a friend, the senses are stimulated by sitting with someone and enjoying their company, there can also be too much of a good thing. That line, too much of a good thing, really does exist. When we move past the boundaries of what is within the realm of good for us, essentially. So overeating, eating when we are just emotional, eating without thinking, mindless eating. And there's a big trend now for mindfulness. And many of you may have heard of, mindfulness. We're trying to be more mindful. But what does mindfulness mean? Essentially, it means keeping the nafs in check. Recognizing when the desire is coming from that basis self, and the desire is pulling us away from the greater purpose. And if food is our weakness, and food does that to us, then it's something to be aware of, and to consistently try to work to control, but also to seek the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created our tests for us. And maybe our test isn't heroin, maybe it's not marijuana, which we haven't even really talked about yet, but maybe it's not drugs, maybe it's not people, maybe our test is food. And if that is our test, then we identify it, we recognize it, we seek the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we try to control it by putting those boundaries in place.
To be honest, you mentioned a couple of things that are drawing two questions, right? So is there a possibility, or could there be a link between the possibility or an increased chance of a person becoming addicted to something and low spirituality, and between also being able to resist addiction and an increased level of spirituality? That's one question. And then when you mentioned marijuana, that also came to my mind, because I always get this question, right? Is it really haram, and is it really addictive, right? So I guess I can give you a choice of picking which questions you guys want to ask or answer. So we have one, the spirituality aspect. Is there a correlation? And then marijuana, is it really addictive or not?
Can I do the marijuana?
Yeah, as I say, you take marijuana.
Like, I'll take the ruling on marijuana. It is haram, so we'll get that out of the way, right? Yes, it is forbidding. Anything that intoxicate you, it takes you out of your complete control of yourself, that is prohibited, okay? And so we'll deal with marijuana first, and then we'll do spirituality, okay?
Sorry, what's the question?
Relax.
Is it
addictive
or not? Sorry, I'm
And
sorry.
it leads to something else.
I was taking notes on the spirituality one. I didn't know you were separating them. So okay. No, it's good. No. I think that's more than qualified. So yes, marijuana is addicting. You know how I know?
No.
I used to be addicted to weed.
No.
Yeah. I used to be addicted to weed. I used to smoke weed when I was, the first time I smoked I was 11, right? And I stopped smoking when I was 18, right? 17, I stopped when I was 17, right? And I had to stop. I had gotten into legal trouble. So I had to stop because I would have gotten in more trouble had I kept smoking. And like after a couple of days of having stopped smoking, like I noticed I was having all these kinds of like physical issues. Now mind you, I'm like 17, I'm a very young man, I was in very good shape. And like I had slept for like 4 days straight. And my mother was a drug counselor. So I was like talking to her about like, what is going on? And she was like, that's withdrawal. Like, you're having, this is withdrawal. Now it's not as serious. It's not like withdrawal from heroin, right? It's not like withdrawal from cocaine. It's not like withdrawal from some of the more serious, hardcore drugs, right? But nevertheless, it is a drug and there is withdrawal and you can become addicted. Now, the physical addiction, I think that this is the problem that we have. People are distinguishing it from physical addiction. Do I think you can become as physically addicted to marijuana as you can with heroin or cocaine or some of these other drugs, any of the other opioid drugs that sometimes we get a hold of, like prescription drugs? I don't necessarily think so, right? But that's probably why we don't have the same physical reaction to the withdrawal. I think with marijuana, it becomes more that we are psychologically addicted and behaviorally addicted. to it, because I never thought I had a problem with marijuana, to be honest. I smoked every day and I hung out. That's all I did. But when I started to look back on it, I started to realize that I was always using everything that I was doing as a reason to smoke. Right? Oh, we're going to the mall, hold on. You know, I need to smoke for that. Oh, we're going to a movie, oh, hold on, I need to smoke for that. And they seem to be these little innocent things in my head. Each one of them is taken individually as being innocent, but what I don't realize is that I have 9 of them in a day. And so, you know, this is one of the ultimate issues with marijuana, is because, and this is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, beware of the shaitan in the little things, concerning the small things. And this is one of the more nefarious issues that we have. You know, I was listening to a comedian talking about a friend of his who smokes weed all the time. And he said, look, I can't deny it. Like, and he's totally like pro, smoke, do whatever you want to do, you know. And he's like, but I have to be honest, my friend has smoked weed every day of his life since we were in high school, and he's never made anything of himself. He has no motivation, no drive, you know, all of these things. And so these are the consequences. You know, you're not going to, you know, be like committing crimes and doing sexual favors and stuff to get a bag of weed, right? Like, that's probably not going to happen. But you're probably not going to do anything else either. And this becomes the problem, is that we kind of define what addiction has to look like. And when what we're doing doesn't fit in that box, then we start to say, well, then I'm not addicted, or I'm not abusing it, and all these things. And so we have to be very, very careful. And I know that we had talked to this, and I'll stop with this comment. We had talked about this in the lead-up, which was the idea, you know, people say that marijuana is a gateway drug. And we get into all of these intellectual and philosophical debates about it. And I say the same thing about marijuana that I say to people about debating about Islam. Islam is the truth. Be careful about debating it, because somebody who might be more beguiling than you might win the argument and conclude that Islam is not the truth because you weren't able to argue it. When it's not that Islam is the truth, it's not that Islam is not the truth, it's just that that person found a way to undercut your argument. Right? And so we have to be careful about kind of looking at these things in the same ways, right? We start to rationalize with ourselves about all of these kinds of drugs. And when you talk about it being a gateway drug, we debate it back and forth, and then somebody who just smoked weed for 20 years, never tried anything else, like, see, it's not a gateway drug. That undercuts my argument, right? But the problem with it is, and I would encourage you all to watch this video. It's called the New Face of Addiction, something like that. I can't, you know,
Can't touch that.
we're gonna get into a fight.
Yeah.
But I think it's called The New Face of Addiction in America. And one of the things that it talks about, you come across, I'm sure you've come across this a million times, I'm sure you've come across this a million times, people think weed's not a drug, right? And so I'll ask people in therapy, you know, what kind of drugs do you do? And they say, I don't do any drugs. And then, of course, I can start going down the list. So you don't do this, you don't do that, you don't do this, you don't do that. And then one girl one day, she said, oh yeah, I smoke weed, but it's not a drug. I'm like, wait, I just asked you, did you do drugs? And she's like, well, it's not a drug. And we get into this debate with each other, right? And so you have to be careful. Again, beware of the shaitan in the little things. The story I was watching, and I show this video to everyone every time we talk about drugs. There was a young woman, she went to college. Upper middle class, family got lots of money, all of these kinds. She got everything that she needs in life. She goes to college, weed ain't a drug, let me try it. She winds up trying what she thinks is weed, it winds up being what? Heroin. She does the heroin, she has the time of her life on it, right? Addicted. Just like that. Now, she does hundreds of hits of heroin in a day. Her parents are giving her money, supporting her heroin addiction, because they don't know what to do. They're just as lost as anyone else, right? And she's hiding out in their basement, just basically doing drugs every day, all day. Was it her intention to get addicted to heroin? So did she have to intend to get addicted? No. She was going in a totally different direction. She thought she was doing something else, and this is why we have to be wary of the shaitan. The shaitan might whisper to you, and you might be whispering to your own self, I'm in control, I know what I'm doing. but you don't know what Allah has decreed for you around the corner when you walk out of your house, right? I come from an era where people would put angel dust in their weed, right? They put angel dust in their weed, PCP. And you ever see the videos when the cops are beating the guy and tasing him and doing all these crazy things and he's still going and he's still fighting and he's naked, right? That's PCP. And people put that in with their weed. And so, we friends. I have no reason, like if I went to your house and you put food on the table, I'm not going to, hey, shit, is this halal? I'm not going to do that to you, right? We're friends. Now, if you're my friend and I see you smoking, we friends. I'm not going to ask you, yeah. I'm not going to ask you that. And so I don't know, and bam. Before I know it, and this has happened so many times to so many people. I know one sister who, and Allah blessed her to get through it. She went on a field trip in high school with her classmates and at school. And they were passing out food. And they gave her a weed brownie. She had never done drugs in her life, never smoked weed in her life. So she had never known what it felt like to be high. Could you imagine? You're eating and then suddenly the high hits you. And you have no idea what's going on, where it came. If you smoke weed, you kind of know that something's going to happen to you. So when something happens to you, you know it's because of what you just did. And she was traumatized. It took months of therapy to help her. She was traumatized by, fearing that she was dying. You don't know. Right? And someone who's been high before, I can't imagine someone high that doesn't know they're high. That has to be terrifying. And so you have to be incredibly careful about the things that you say and rationalize as it relates to any addiction. And I want to make this last point. I'm sorry for being so long-winded, but Suzy, you said something earlier about food, and it reminded me immediately. One of the problems with addiction is that addiction works, right? If you want to numb yourself from some kind of pain, there's something that's going to numb you, right? The problem with that is twofold. You're going to keep doing it again because you know that it works, but then number two, you never learn the skills that you really need to cope with what's bothering you in a more healthy way, right? Because alcohol numbs the pain, because finding a girl online or finding a guy online numbs the pain, you never learn how to deal with the pain and how to heal from the pain on your own. Relying upon Allah, seeking support from your family and friends, seeking counseling and guidance from other people. You don't do any of that. Why? Because you got a counselor in the Bible. And you have to be very, very careful of that, is that you get what you want from that drug, but the drug is also robbing you at the same time of your emotional strength. And so by the time you even want to get off the drug has taken so much of your emotional strength, you don't even have enough strength to get off of that.
So actually this kind of leads, because you touched about Iman and spirituality a little bit, so I'm just kind of going to switch it over to, so the question once again, is there really a correlation between a person possibly getting easier into aspects of addiction with low spirituality and a person being able to get out of it or resist it with high spirituality?
I think the best way to approach that question is to understand how cyclical it really is. We often ask, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? But the reality is, a lot of times, someone may have a struggle with spirituality, with their Iman. They wake up, they pray Fajr, but then, by the time Dhuhr rolls around or Asr rolls around, they're like, oh, I'm tired. They don't get through the rest of their salah. The spirituality decreases, right? This is why we're constantly reminded to repeat the dua of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinak. O changer of the hearts, keep my heart steadfast on your faith. And so, as the spirituality may dip, we may seek out that sense of wanting to uplift the emotions somewhere else. And so we may turn to an addiction, and the spirituality will continue to sink. So it's cyclical. There can be a link between low spirituality and an addiction, but it can also be the addiction that spurs the low spirituality, or the low spirituality that spurs the addiction. And I think one of the best ways to better understand this is we see that when the hikmah, the injunction of banning alcohol at the time of the Jahiliyyah, we know that alcohol was a huge part of the lifestyle prior to Islam. That it was something, that was so commonly done in every event, every activity, every gathering. It was a part of the culture. And so the initial injunction of banning alcohol in our deen was not, leave all that is alcoholic or alcohol related. It was do not approach your salah while intoxicated. That was the initial restriction on something that was clearly addictive. And so what happened was those who turned to Islam, who wanted to follow the hikmah of Allah and the guidance of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would say, okay, well, I'm going to pray Fajr, and maybe then I'll drink between Fajr and Dhuhr. But then they would think, wait, I'm going to be intoxicated then, so I really can't drink between Fajr and Dhuhr, and I shouldn't drink between Dhuhr and Asr because I might be intoxicated by the time Asr comes, and so on and so forth. And so eventually, as the spirituality increased, the need and the desire for the addicting element of the alcohol decreased. And so we absolutely have to see the correlation between spirituality and addictive behavior. But again, we can't really specify and say, if you have low spirituality, then you're likely to be addicted. Because it may be the likelihood of your addiction that can lead you to a lower spirituality. But when we increase our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we increase our iman, when we make our salah and our conversations with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the markers in our lives that define that sense of seeking pleasure and seeking fulfillment, we find ourselves naturally turning away from alternatives. Naturally turning away from seeking that emotional high from a substance, from a person, from something that may not be beneficial for us.
So I just had a couple of thoughts about this same question. Oh, I'm sorry. So one of the things that, alhamdulillah, listening to Sister Suzy, is the idea of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he talked about the salawat being like a white thobe that is washed 5 times a day, and how you wouldn't find any uncleanliness on it if you had washed it 5 times a day. And so this to me is that strengthening of your iman, of course, is what I say acts as a guard to some degree against falling into addiction. And when I say a guard, I also want to liken our iman to going to the gym and exercising regularly, right? We know from the research that people who work out, who exercise regularly, they don't get sick as often as most people, right? And even when they do get sick for a shorter number of days, right? So they don't get sick a whole lot, and even when they do get sick, it's not for very long. And having strong iman protects you in the same way. That the addiction, you're less likely to become addicted. And if you become addicted, you're more likely to be able to get through it when you have higher iman. And if you notice, again, like Suzy said, I'm not saying one is a product of the other. I'm saying that iman acts as a guard for you, right? Because I don't want people to leave here saying, if you don't have iman, that's why you got addicted. Because there are people with very strong iman who are addicted. But the iman, alhamdulillah, becomes a tool and a resource that the person without iman does not have to try to help them to overcome it. Does this make sense? And so having low iman leaves you more vulnerable to addiction, meaning you might be addicted more often than people who have higher iman. And you might be addicted longer than people who have higher iman, potentially. And so we see here that the iman is like a safeguard. The other thing that I want to say is the idea of spirituality versus biology. Just like our spiritualities vary, our biologies vary. And so just because me and you can use the same drug, and I can become addicted and you don't, or you can become addicted and I don't, because our biologies, our brains are made up differently, our bodies are made up differently, and you might be more vulnerable physically to becoming addicted to a drug than myself. And so don't take for granted, again, even your body. I said earlier, don't take for granted, mentally that you can't get addicted, but also don't take for granted you don't know your body. You don't know your body, you don't know your brain. There have been many people, and Suzy can attest to this, I'm sure Dr. Ahmed, you can attest to this, that there have been many people who took a drug and were never the same again. They never ever recovered from taking that drug. I'm not exaggerating, they're not exaggerating. They're very rare cases, but it does happen. You can take a drug and never be the same. Because that drug alters your body, it alters your DNA the moment you take it. It alters your brain the moment you take it. And I'm going to stop, I'm going to give this back to you, but I want to tell you one thing about, we talked about this idea of the addiction gets in the way of your ability to cope, right? I'm going to tell you how heroin works. And why heroin is so hard to break. The addiction to heroin is so hard to break. So, your brain produces chemicals that are meant to help you fight the feeling of pain. And part of fighting that feeling of pain is giving you a feeling of euphoria, right? And so your brain makes chemicals that give you that euphoric feeling, that intoxicating feeling. We call it runner's high. If you run long enough, you start to feel high. Why? Because you've been running so long that your body's in pain, and your body knows you're not going to stop anytime soon, so it releases these chemicals into your brain and your body to give you a high to help you learn to deal with the pain. Everybody with me so far? Yes? Heroin, just like a key fits into a lock to open a door, heroin is shaped just like that chemical that your brain makes. And so when heroin goes into your body, your brain thinks, oh, this is the chemical that I make. And it attaches to your brain and gives you all of those same euphoric feelings. And your brain is smart. Your brain looks around and says, oh, I have all of these pain relief chemicals floating around. I have too many, so I need to start making what? Less. I need to make less pain relief chemicals. Your body is not making the pain relief chemicals. The only thing that's in charge of your pain relief now is what? Heroin. And then if I tell you don't take heroin, you no longer have your pain relief chemical, heroin, and your brain's no longer making the pain relief chemical. So what are you left with? Feeling. Pain. And no way to stop it. And so what you're going to do? You're going to make your brain make more faster? Or what? What are you going to do? I'm going to go get some heroin. Not because I want to, but because I feel like I can't survive. I literally feel like I cannot survive without it. This is why it's so hard to kick. Right? And we do this in a lot of other ways with a lot of the other drugs that we take into our lives, not necessarily just into our bodies. So I'm sorry to belabor, but I just wanted to make these points.
To be honest, there's quite a few things I was hoping we cover, whether it's juuling, vaping, cigarettes, shisha, hookahs, a bunch of whole other things. But I'm gonna, hopefully somebody from the floor, I want to open the floor for questions. But before I finish, I want to actually kind of wrap all this up to ask what are the resources that we have that can help someone who is addicted to any of these things, whether they are behavioral addictions, whether they are substance addictions, whether it's gaming, pornography, any sort of other addiction. What are the resources that we have? I'm going to open this up to both of you, inshallah, and then take questions from the ground.
I think one of the best sources that I have found for pornography addictions is actually an online resource with a Muslim nonprofit group out in California. It's called Purify Your Gaze. And it's a beautiful 12-week program. Most of these programs are 12-week programs. It's a 12-week program in which you are guided through the process of essentially purifying your gaze from the Islamic context. And I've seen it work for so many people who had been addicted to pornography, who felt like they couldn't stop it. We have a group called Sex Anon, which is a 12-week program, a Muslim group up in North Jersey that convenes for 12 weeks. And we've had people who are addicted to relationships outside of marriage, addicted to the act of sexuality, essentially. And again, it's a program that is designed to help those people who are struggling with that addiction. We have, of course, we have actually Muslim groups of Alcoholics Anonymous. And again, sometimes we think, oh, why? We don't have that problem in our communities. We do have that problem, just like any other community. And whatever test someone's struggling with, it may be different. It may not be your test, but it's still a test. And there are a lot of these support groups. Most of the support groups are 12 weeks long. Speak to a Muslim counselor, reach out to, whether it's Dr. Ray, myself. We have a whole list of Muslim counselors in the New York, New Jersey area, and Pennsylvania as well. Reach out, talk to someone. Whatever your struggle is, we touched briefly on emotional eating, for example, but just as overeating is an addiction, bulimia, anorexia, those are also types of addictions where you cannot have a healthy relationship with food because you become addicted to throwing up after every meal or not eating. So these addictions all exist, and it's not one catch-all that we say, okay, make dua, pray 2 rak'ahs and you'll be okay. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to us the means sometimes with which we can recover or get over our struggle. So reach out, speak to someone. Whatever test you're going through, there is, inshallah, a solution, a means, a way to work through it. But just ask and you'll find out, inshallah.
Yes. One of the things, and alhamdulillah, I think you covered a lot. So I only want to cover the other side of it, which is how do you get help for someone else? Right? Because you might be the family member, the loved one of the spouse, or a parent of somebody who really needs help. And part of that is to not be afraid to say that. Sometimes we don't want to challenge people who need help because we're afraid that because we push them to get help, that they're not going to want to be around us, right? If I tell you to get help, you're going to leave the house. If I tell you to get help, you're going to divorce me. If I tell you to get help, you might beat me up, or any of those kinds of things. And the reality of it is that we have to be brave enough at least to say that. If you don't feel safe in a situation, I think that maybe you need to tell that person they need to get help from a distance. Right? No one is forcing you to have to be in the same space with them if you don't feel physically safe. We also, again, we still have to be courageous enough to say to them, listen, you might not feel like you have a problem, but this thing that you're doing is harming me. And so whether it's a problem to you or not, doesn't really matter in the context of the fact that it hurts you. And so if you don't feel like you have a problem, are you willing to get help with this in order to stop hurting me or not? Right? If I literally just got off the phone with someone who felt like they had a problem, that to me did not sound like it was a problem, but they were doing it because the person in their life thought it was a problem. Does that make sense? And so there's nothing stopping you from at least saying that, because sometimes we feel like we have to convince the person that they have a problem. But you will not be able to do that to the degree that the person needs this thing in their lives. For instance, and we say this a lot in therapy, don't take away somebody's coping mechanism unless you've given them another one. And so sometimes if you go to someone who has an addiction, but the addiction serves the purpose of protecting them from having been abused all of their lives, they're not going to want to let go of the addiction, because once I stop smoking or stop whatever, gambling or stop whatever it is I'm doing, all I'm left with is my thoughts about what happened to me. Right? Does that make sense? And so sometimes it's not always about convincing the person, because they have a real serious reason why they're going to convince themselves psychologically it's not a problem. So you're already fighting a losing battle. This again is that idea that Islam is the truth, and if someone out debates you, it's not because Islam isn't the truth, it's just because you weren't able to debate it. This person might have a problem, but when you come to them and they don't want to fix it or they don't believe you, it's not because you're not telling them the truth. It's because they have a real serious reason for why they want to hold on to what they're holding on to. So part of it sometimes is to tell the person, you need to fix it for me. Now, this person is either going to get the help or not going to get the help. And you might have to escalate it from there. The person who needs help at that time is you. If you're dealing with someone who has an addiction and they won't get any help, you should get help. Right? Why? Because you probably need support around how do you address this issue with this person in your life? Right? And that's a very, very easy thing to overlook, and even to get some direction and guidance and support around how you want to proceed, because beyond what I'm saying to you here, I wouldn't dare give you any more recommendations beyond that, because it might be something that doesn't apply to everybody's situation and can be incredibly damaging to your situation. So I can't say like, oh, then you should leave the house, right? Because that might be terrible advice for somebody else. And sometimes you don't give advice, sometimes you just give support. Sometimes you know you need to leave the house. So we already know what you need to do. I just need to support you until you feel like you're ready. Everybody with me on these? So I just wanted to make that last point sure.
So I'm going to open the questions to the floor if anybody has any questions. Please feel free to ask. Raise your hands. Or if you want to text it, let me know. I'll give you a number. Yes, sir. Sorry, go ahead.
This marijuana you're talking about, this is becoming legalized also. Where DSM stands, I mean, what do you say about it?
Sorry, what was the question?
The DSM.
The D? Oh, DSN?
DSM.
Okay. So, that's kind of funny. By the way, middle schoolers know about this stuff, right? They even joke about it. They say, who married Joanna, right? But because they know it's becoming legalized, it's news. So, so he's asking, can you answer that question, or?
Oh, I thought you were asking.
No,
Answering.
he's answering. No, I can't. I can't answer that question. It's not my field. So the question is what? What if it becomes legalized?
Yeah,
What does?
they're making it normal, like in all the psychology books and all these bad things, they're saying, okay, it's okay. And even the counselors are like encouraging people.
So I think, that normalization is a very key term that you just said. That right now, marijuana is not only becoming legalized, but it's also becoming normalized. And we hear it in conversations, we hear it in our Islamic school classrooms, we hear it in our messages, we hear it in our youth groups, in the conventions. It's become normalized to the point where the question becomes like, it's natural. Why would it be haram? How is it any worse than coffee? It makes me feel good, but I'm not addicted to it. It's the same thing as sugar. Sugar is more poisonous for your body than marijuana is. And we've heard all of these arguments and this perspective. Now, realistically speaking, what is currently legal in most places is the medical marijuana, where you can have a medical marijuana card. The medical marijuana card allows you to use marijuana for medicinal reasons. Recreational marijuana, of course, we know in places like Colorado and California, it's moving its way to the East Coast. It's not here yet, but it will move its way here. So, just because something is legal does not make it halal, does not make it healthy, does not make it beneficial to us. Alcohol is legal. Alcohol has been legal for a very long time. Under the period of prohibition, when it was illegal, there was actually higher incidence of intoxication and alcohol-related diseases than when it was legal. So whether it's legal or not should not affect the way that we as a society, as a community, looks at, the detrimental effects of it. Marijuana is detrimental. Marijuana is not something that falls within the scope of what we should view as permissible in our deen, because it alters our being, it alters our state of mind, it alters our sense of self, and without a doubt, and there are many studies now coming out, if you want to look up in particular a scholar, there's a scholar by the last name of Bandura, who has done an extensive amount of research on the link between intrinsic motivation and marijuana, and how the intrinsic motivation, which is essentially what exists within you to motivate you to do good, decreases and is inhibited by the use of marijuana. So any child, any young person, any adult even that tells you marijuana doesn't affect me, marijuana is halal, it's legal, it's fine, tell them no. Tell them go do your research, because it's all there. And the same exists for when you look at the nicotine concentration within the juuling tabs, for example. And since Dr. Ahmed had brought those up, Juuling is something, and I see the young people kind of nodding and smiling, so I think they know what I'm talking about. So a few years back, vaping was the big thing, and vaping was essentially e-cigarettes that had a smaller dosage of nicotine in them, a smaller concentration of nicotine. There would be smoke that would be emitted from the e-cigarettes. So what children would do, what high schoolers and junior high schoolers would do, they'd go into the bathroom with a water bottle, and they would smoke it, the vape into the water bottle so that the smoke would be contained. So of course, those who profit from these items created something that's like a cartridge that looks like a USB disc, where some people will say juuling is a type of vaping, but it's slightly different because it has a higher concentration of nicotine. The smoke is not emitted in the same way that the traditional e-cigarettes are emitted, and so it's essentially created for young people. And it comes in 3 flavors: bubblegum, mint, and I believe Tutti Frutti is the other one or something. Flavors that are designed to lure in children. So when we talk about any of these substances, and including marijuana, especially marijuana, it is a complete marketing trend and a push. 20 years from now, I guarantee you they'll come back and say, oops, yeah, marijuana really wasn't good for you. But by then they would have profited and made all the money that they needed to make off of it. And so it's really just a money game. The government doesn't care, whether or not it's going to poison us. Because if that was the case, alcohol would have been, banned and it would have been fine. It's all about what works money-wise. So when a young person engages with you and tells you marijuana is natural, so then it's halal, marijuana doesn't change my state of mind, there is so much research that shows how it does change the mind and the body. And there is also a lot of research on what it does to the system. And so there's a lot of responses that we can give, but we need to do our research as well.
I want to say one thing about psychology. Just in terms of, you asked a question about the DSM, which is our diagnostic, the book that we use to come up with the diagnoses and stuff. We have to be careful about relying on psychology as a field to give us an understanding. I think that some ways it's helpful, in some ways it's not. Being in the field, psychology is reactive. It's not proactive, right? And so our decisions about things in our field of psychology tends to be after the fact of everybody else's reaction. Does that make sense? And so we kind of shift with the public opinions as they shift. You know what I'm saying? And so this is that idea, again, like, I'll give you an example, right? And so I have this letter that one of the presidents of the Psychological Association sent to an Army general, right? Basically ripping the general apart for calling homosexuality a disease, right? They ripped this general apart. You gotta learn, when the hypocrisy of it is, it wasn't too long in the past that in the DSM, homosexuality was a disease. He got the idea from us. And now we're tearing him apart because he thinks that way, right? And so we have to be careful of, psychology is going to tell you a lot about things that you didn't know. But we also have to kind of look at everything within the lens of Islam. You know what I mean? Because one day this is permissible or not permissible culturally or socially, and we're going to move along with it. I want to share one last point before you want to know the sister had a question too. You have mentioned the financial piece. The only reason that these states are legalizing marijuana is because they realize how much money they'll make when they can tax it. Right? That's really the financial motivator. Had it not been for the stock market crash and the housing crisis and all of these things, I'm from Atlantic City. And so I watched Atlantic City fall apart. Why? Because all of the states around us, around New Jersey, was like, we need to open up some casinos and bring in some money. They didn't want casinos until they started losing money. They weren't legalizing marijuana until they started losing money. And so we have to be very, very careful about people's motivations behind telling us what's right and wrong for us as Muslims.
Yes, your question?
So, Suzy was talking about marijuana. Of course, if it's legal, it doesn't make it halal. But you didn't touch upon medical marijuana. of course, I'm under the assumption that if it helps medically and it's under the, certain dosages and things like that, then it would be allowed, right?
So I think this goes back to what we were speaking about earlier, about control, If someone has a medical marijuana card and they are utilizing it within the doses, the way that you use Tylenol, the way you use Advil, the way that you use, any other kind of medication or medication that's over, that's a prescription medication, then you're not abusing it. And remember what Dr. Ray had said before, there's use, there's abuse, and there's addiction. And I think you can take Percocet, and you can take Percocet for the pain, and you can be fine. But why do we have so many young people addicted to Percocet, and then moving on to harder and stronger opioids after that? Because they fall from the place of use to abuse, and then eventually to addiction. Marijuana is the same. If it is something that is being prescribed, and that is being within doses to treat an actual medical issue, then it falls within the same realm as so many of the other medications we take. But the minute it goes outside the realm, just like we said, food, it can be beneficial, it can be healthy, it can be halal. But when we start to move into the realm where it is abusing essentially that good that's been given to us, then it falls into the haram.
I have one more question, I'm sorry. I was sent here by some friends, and so hookah, when you were saying vaping also, so that would be permissible? I didn't hear what you said about that, I just heard the...
Yes. Okay. So again, let's talk about the altering of the state. So anything that is ingested within us that alters the state of being, that alters the mind in a way that can cause actions that either pull us away from that which is most pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or lead us towards something which is not pleasing to Him, can fall into that space of haram. Now we know again that there is a clear line between the halal and there's the haram. And then there is an area of gray. But we are advised not to go near that area of gray. So when we talk about vaping, when we talk about juuling, the liquid includes nicotine. And that's even though a lot of young people will be like, oh no, it's just water and flavor, it has nothing in it. It includes nicotine. And you can look it up, all of the items that you'll find that it includes that. With hookah, you go to hookah lounges, usually it's not just shredded apple that they've got in there. It's usually a type of tobacco that is apple flavored. It has nicotine. Nicotine is a drug. There's nothing that we can say like, well, no, nicotine is not really a drug. It's a drug. It has addictive qualities. I mean, that's why in order to, take nicotine out of your system, you use like a patch or you use Nicorette because you need to slowly withdraw from it. So allowing that drug to be ingested within your system is moving you into a place where there is physiological changes that occur. And so, of course, Allah Alam, it didn't exist, maybe juuling and vaping didn't exist at the time of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but we take the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and we apply it to our lives today. So anything that is pulling us away from that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that definitely has a big question mark next to it at the least, and at the most is something that may fall into that which is impermissible. Allah Alam.
Can I just say a couple of things?
Can I just address that for a second, right? So when it comes to hookahs and cigarettes, by the way, the majority of the associations of fiqh councils and so forth, they have determined it's not permissible, the majority of them. But it's not based necessarily on nicotine, but it's more based on the medical result of it. So the research that shows that you smoke this, besides the other chemicals, it results into whether it's brain cancer or how many different types of cancer and those issues. And so they deduced from that, the ones who were prohibited, deduced that you are actually almost like the same thing as committing suicide, right? And so it's based on that. Now, I think we might have a whole nother debate if you're just saying nicotine.
No, I have another question now.
Yes.
So that was what we were debating, right?
Yes.
That it causes harm.
Yes.
And there's no doubt that it's unhealthy for you, and yes, the cancer and all that. Then we were saying sugar.
All right. So here's the thing. Once again, the reason that's why I want to separate between the ruling and why it is suggested that it is prohibited. Separate the nicotine from the results. Okay. So when we talk about sugar, right? The number of cancer being caused by the chemicals in tobacco is completely different than sugar.
But it's fed by sugar.
Sorry?
So cancer feeds off of sugar too. So
No, that is true. It's a biological system. But you have to have cancer for it to feed off sugar. Sugar doesn't cause cancer. But also, here's the problem. You can't say sugar, why? I have to do biology. This is my area of field, right? Sugar is a carbohydrate, which means any carbohydrate you eat should be prohibited. Bread, rice, macaroni, you don't want to go down the roads. Okay? Milk, it will produce sugar. So even if you cut off that sugar, the white sugar that you think of, your cancer will be fed by the other sugars. So that's not even an argument in the first place. Again, there's no scientific basis to it. All right? The difference is will it cause cancer or not, the percentage, all these things. But once again, I said the majority of the fiqh councils deemed it impermissible for that reason. So not pertaining to nicotine, right? Because somebody can say, well, what about caffeine? Right? But does caffeine alter your state of mind? Right? It doesn't. Like you don't go crazy, right? You don't go. It doesn't. Like, it really does all these things. Right? So there's everything is unless they're proven otherwise. Okay? Does that clarify a little bit? So I just had to kind of jump in about this.
That's I wanted to say. I have a couple of things that I wanted to mention, and when you talk about like hookah and stuff like that, I think that because it's culturally accepted, right? And again, I said that our minds find ways to get the thing that we want, right? And so usually when we're talking about hookah, shisha, these kinds of things that are culturally accepted, we're not thinking about Allah, we're thinking about ourselves. And we're doing the math on, how can I still get it? And so you kind of invent these philosophical mechanisms that ultimately still, like, no matter what approach you take at them, they still bring you to, it's permissible, right? So whatever argument someone gives you, you're still going to end up at, is permissible. Whatever shape you ask, you're going to end up at, is permissible. And I say to people, you have to be very, very skeptical of yourself in those moments. To say to yourself, no matter how many times or how many different ways I ask this question, I keep coming up with the same answer from within myself. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says that halal is clear and haram is clear, right? And that the haram, it still stirs within your chest, no matter how many people have weighed in on it. Meaning, someone can come to you and tell you 100 times that something is permissible, but there's still something that's a part of you that's holding on to that. I don't know, there's still a part of you that feels motivated to justify it. And these are one of the signs usually that we're dealing with something that's not permissible, that we're trying to convince ourselves is permissible. When you talk about all of these different chemicals, you have to understand, when you stand in front of Allah, did you do right by your body with that chemical, yes or no? Right? Did you do right by your body with that chemical, yes or no? When you talk about I think medical marijuana was the question that you had asked. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is, I'm not saying this about you, but I mean in general, us as Muslims, we are not familiar at all with the Quran. And so when we're asking questions, you're usually getting answers from someone who's read the Quran. Right? You're usually getting answers from someone who's read the Hadith. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. What does Allah say after that? In them, there's sin, the harm, and the benefit. And the harm is greater than the benefit. Even Allah said there's a benefit to marijuana. Even Allah said there's a benefit to alcohol. There's a benefit to cocaine. Heroin was created by the Bayer Corporation. Bayer that makes those aspirins and stuff that you take. They're the ones who invented heroin. They invented heroin to get people off of morphine addiction. And then, and so it's not that there was no benefit. They created these things to try to help people. But the harm turned out to be what? Greater than the benefit. And so who are we going to trust here? Right? Are we going to trust Allah, or are we going to trust the desire that's behind us, motivating us to do the wrong? Right? The second thing I want to say about this is, Allah also says, fear Allah as much as you are able. Right? And I say this because I don't want to be cold-hearted. I think it's easier to be cold-hearted about medical marijuana. But I can say to you for myself, right? Like, I went into my wife's delivery you know, like, oh, you know, the drugs they want to give her, you know, they're haram, this and that. Like, I don't know, should I advise her? I'm not the one having the baby, this ain't the time. They have that conversation. And then I saw her in all that pain, and I went from like that to just making to offer her. Oh Allah, if she takes something that's not permissible, just forgive her. You know the situations that she's, you know what I mean? But there's no part of me ever that said, this is halal because it helps. And we have to be very, very careful because Allah, He Himself said that there's a benefit and a harm. So I can't say that because it benefited her is permissible because Allah said there's a benefit. Allah already acknowledged there's a benefit, but Allah said the harm. We have to be careful of the gateway for ourselves as Muslims. Just imagine if socially as Muslims we started to say medical marijuana is permissible. Just in mass, medical marijuana is permissible. Where are we going after that? You understand? And this is again back to that idea of being aware of the shaitan in the little things. Because we started trying to be sensitive. Right? Our progressive culture got the best of us. And we got tired of being looked at as these heathens, you know what I mean, who were so strict. And so we let that thing in the door. I'm sorry to, you know, again, I hate to belabor these points. We also have to remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says two things about our wrongdoing that I want to remind you of, especially as it relates to the impermissibility of these substances. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that shaitan makes our wrongdoing fair seeming to us. Shaitan will tell you, no, it's all right. And because you want it, you're going to say, it's all right. Allah also says that the wrongdoers make their wrongdoing fair seeming to their own selves. And so we have to be very, very careful of taking on these traits and qualities that Allah is describing in a way that He dislikes. And so we have to be careful of engaging in something by being incredibly philosophical about it so that we don't feel bad about what we're doing that's wrong. Right? Don't do wrong intentionally, do wrong by mistake. Do wrong sometimes because you feel forced or desperate or whatever it is that you're going to make tawbah about it. Because if you feel like, for instance, medical marijuana, if you feel like medical marijuana is okay, you'll never make tawbah. And if you're making tawbah, that means you know it's not right. And you have to be careful of these things with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because it's not about, again, it's not about beating me in a moral debate. You have to stand in front of Allah with that, not me.
Do you have more questions? I think there's a couple more.
My head, it's okay.
Sorry?
It's all right.
Okay. Any more questions? Yes, Jim.
Is there any example from the early days of Islam where the Sahaba or somewhere in that region of any addiction or anything?
Alcoholism.
Yeah.
Alcoholism, Jim. Alcoholism.
Yeah.
It was rampant, right?
How did they deal with it? Is there any
So Aisha said something beautiful about it. You don't mind if I answer this, okay? So Aisha, she said something beautiful, right? So in the inclination, the meaning, she said, you know, that if the Islam would have been come to them immediately as halal and haram, they would not have left anything. However, it has come increasing their iman, and so when it was told them to leave it, they left it. So that's why alcohol was kind of prohibited in stages. Because this, we're talking about this is something that is a cultural norm. They don't think they're alcoholics. It's a cultural norm. This is the norm. And so essentially it came in waves, telling them, like, you know, that there's harms and there's good in this. That's it. And then it moved to the next stage of don't approach prayers while, you know. Actually, the first one was actually almost hinted. It was a subtle hint. The first one was a subtle hint that, like, you know, what use grapes for, like, you know, using things, and then other things, right? Kind of mentioning, and then aspect of that there is harm in it. And then the third stage was stay away from it. Like, you know, don't approach prayers; you're intoxicated. And so they usually never drink until, like, you know, after they finish all their prayers. And some of them even stopped from the beginning. And then in the end, it came complete prohibition. And so this is how it dealt with them. Just to answer your question quickly, but yes, there was an addiction there at that time. Hold on.
There's specific hadith about people who were drinking and couldn't stop.
Any other questions? جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خير for everybody attending and stay with us until the end. جزاكم الله خير.
Thank you.